we are Christian. That's what our first guiding principle says. We are Christian. As you know, there have been groups meeting over the last number of months to discuss the guiding principles and perhaps to update them. And there's been a smaller group taking in all that feedback and input. We've been working on that, and we're ready to present it to you in September. But I'll tell you that one of the discussions that came up at the neighborhood groups is, do we want "we are Christian" to be the first guiding principle? So in our smaller group, the task force, we spent time going over every word. We spent time in deep and rich discussion. We came to agreement on what we think represents what you all told us. There's only one thing that we were split 4-4 on, and that was which guiding principle should come first. We are Christian, or we are a spiritual community. Now, so you will get to decide as a congregation. Now, I think the reason that some people wanted "we are Christian" first is because we are. I mean, here we are in church. I think some other people were a little hesitant to put "we are Christian" first because of what Christian has come to mean to many in our society, particularly in our nation. Are you with me thus far? Okay. Now, the early followers of Jesus were not called Christian. They were called people of the way, but they were struggling with a similar thing. What does it really mean to follow Jesus? Because we're asking, what does it really mean to be Christian? The Epistle of James that Jorge read from this morning has a lot to say about being a follower of Christ. Now, remember, James, who wrote this letter, this epistle, was writing to a struggling community that was undergoing great suffering, a lot of violence, and a lot of confusion. A nascent community that was trying to live their values in the midst of really a horrible situation. James is the brother of Jesus. Now, he hardly mentions Jesus at all in his book, I might add. I don't know if it's sibling rivalry or what, but he hardly refers to his brother. He doesn't quote him, but James writes a very practical book, more like the book of Proverbs in the Hebrew Bible. Practical advice, pragmatic wisdom on how to be a follower of Jesus. And at the heart of his epistle is what Jorge read this morning. What good is it, James says, if you say you have faith, but you do not have works? If you have faith, but do nothing, your faith is dead. Now, in October, we will celebrate the 500th anniversary of the Reformation. Lots being written about it. I'll preach a whole sermon about in 18 minutes. Its impact and influence over the last 500 years. I'm trying to get a scholar to come in to say a little more, but what you need to know for the purposes of today is that Martin Luther disliked the book of James. In fact, he was hostile toward it because Martin Luther was all about we are justified by faith alone. It is not works that can save us. So he just wanted to take James right on out of the Bible. I read 4 articles in the last 2 weeks that made me think about the relationship of faith and works, and underlying that, what it really means to be a Christian. Those 4 articles prompted what I've come to say and try to explore with you today. The first article was from the Atlantic, June 14th. The title, "A Resolution Condemning White Supremacy Causes Chaos at the Southern Baptist Convention." Now, the Southern Baptist Convention annual meeting turned rather chaotic in Phoenix this week over a resolution that condemned white supremacy and the alt-right. On Tuesday, leaders initially declined to consider the proposal submitted by a prominent black pastor in Texas, Dwight McKissick, and only changed course after significant backlash. And on Wednesday afternoon in the conference, a rewritten or revised statement was put forward and passed. But the drama over the resolution revealed deep tension lines within a denomination that was explicitly founded to support slavery. Now, proposals, like at most general conferences, have to go through committees before they go to the floor for a general vote. The resolution committee didn't put McKissick's proposal forward. The head of the resolution committee said, "We were very aware that on this issue feelings run high regarding alt-right ideology. We share those feelings. We just weren't certain we could craft a resolution that would enable us to measure our strong convictions with the grace of love, which we're also commended by Jesus to incorporate." Not exactly sure what that means, but let's move on. Now, responding to the chaos of all this, McKissick, right, the initial author of the proposal, said several of the resolutions they endorsed yesterday were just carte blanche things that Southern Baptists believe. So, it becomes a mystery how you can so easily affirm standard beliefs about other things, but when we get to white supremacy, all of a sudden, we've got a problem. Second article, New York Times, this past Monday, entitled, "Is Your God Dead?" It's by George Yancey, who's a professor of philosophy at Emory University. And basically, he's asking the same question that James asked: what good is it if you have faith, but you do not have works? George Yancey quotes the famous Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, who was a great influencer and friend of Martin Luther King Jr. Heschel warns of religious shallowness and our tendency to worry more about the purity of dogma than about the integrity of love. Heschel writes, as Yancey quotes him, "How dare we come before God with our prayers when we commit atrocities against the one image we have of the divine, human beings? If there is a shred of life left in your God, full resuscitation might begin with remaining in the presence of that suffering face. If your God is dead, the possibility for a resurrection might be found in attending to the pain and sorrow of that image of the divine there on the street." Yancey begins to unlayer in this kind of lengthy, somewhat rambling article. He's saying that the lie on which the Holocaust began is still with us. White nativist theology. Anti-Semitism is on the rise. And he says, so is the belief that black pathology is eroding America from within. Black people are told that we live in poverty, that our schools are no good, and we have no jobs. In addition, if we just build a wall so this divisive logic goes, more of our problems will dissipate. After all, it is the Mexicans, we are told, who are bringing drugs, crimes, and rapists. He goes back to Heschel, who says, any God who is mine but not yours, any God concerned with me but not with you, is an idol. Yancey says, where does God dwell in America today? Where does moral religious leadership in America come from today? He says, I look, but I have not seen it. Perhaps like Diogenes the cynic, you'll find me carrying a lamp in the daytime, but instead of looking for an honest man, I will be looking through the catacombs of your own making, asking, is your God dead? third article by Jim Wallace, the founder of Sojourners. This article is a blog that he writes on sojo.net. Jim Wallace is a socially engaged evangelical. He writes, Christians across the political spectrum oppose cuts to the poor. Very pertinent, right? This week with the budget coming out, health care trying to be rushed through the Senate before people go away on July 4th break and actually have to face their constituents. Okay? Let me say something about Jim Wallace. In the first year of seminary, Jim Wallace and his friends did a thorough study to find every verse in the Bible that deals with the poor and social injustice, and they came up with thousands. In the first 3 Gospels, 1 out of 10 verses. In the Gospel of Luke, 1 out of 7. They could not recall a single sermon on the poor in their home churches. Now, I want to tell you that growing up as a conservative Baptist, and remember, we thought the Southern Baptists were liberal. Little window into my twisted mind. I grew up early on during the Vietnam War. I never recall once hearing my pastor even mention the Vietnam War in church. Back to Jim Wallace and his friends. One of them found an old Bible and began to cut out every single biblical text about the poor. He ended up with a Bible full of holes. In the article, Jim Wallace brings together a statement from religious leaders across denominations and political spectrums, saying the biblical prophets remind us that how we treat the most marginal and vulnerable among us is the test of a nation's moral righteousness. He goes on to say that if we cut $600 billion from Medicaid, America's poorest and most vulnerable people will suffer. 60% of the cuts proposed in the upcoming budget come from programs that serve the poor. Fourth article. 2 weeks ago, the front page of the Sunday New York Times. Liberals fighting for their faith. Perhaps you saw it. Big photo of Reverend Dr. William Barber on the front. After 40 years in which the Christian right has dominated the influence of organized religion on American politics, souring some people on religion altogether, left-leaning faith leaders are hungry to break the right's grip on setting the nation's moral agenda. Those on the religious left want to turn instead to what they see as truly fundamental biblical imperatives, caring for the poor, welcoming strangers, and protecting the earth, and maybe even change some minds about what it means to be a believer. William Barber, who also calls himself an evangelical, said, "If you think this is just a left versus right movement, you're missing the point. This is about the moral center. This is about our humanity." We use, he says, the words that progressives have thrown away: morality, welfare, poor, and faith, because those are soul words. From reading these articles, it affirmed my belief that I think there is happening a great spiritual awakening, a great moral awakening, a great compassionate awakening in our country across faith. People are starting to realize that the one true religion is caring for all people. And that religion transcends any particular faith tradition. My faith, as you might imagine, has changed radically since those early days of conservative Baptist New Hampshire. One of the things that began to change me most fundamentally, and I use that word intentionally, is when I saw the kind of poverty that I saw in Peru, in Lima, Peru, and then in Delhi, India. And I found my Bible full of holes. I began to look about and read about liberation theology, which taught that God has a preferential option for the poor. People say, well, how can God prefer or treat specially the poor? How can God's heart be for one people more than another? Well, a South African theologian explained it this way. A mother loves all her children, but when one of them is beaten, she can't help but run to that one. We need to care for one another on an individual level and also care about the systems that so marginalize and keep people in some of the situations that they are in. It's a great story of a village that was very caring and lived near a river, and they started noticing that bodies were floating down the river, and they said, we need to do something about this. So they would get the bodies out of the river and give them a decent burial and say words over them, and they were passionate about this. And they did this for a long time, until finally one of the villagers said, how about we send somebody up the river and see what's causing these bodies to float down the river? We need both. We need Mother Teresa's who care for the deaf and the dying. We need Gandhis who change the whole system. And our faith invites us, encourages us, challenges us to do both. James says it this way: religion that is pure and undefiled before God is this, to care for orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself unstained by the world. Religion that is undefiled is a religion where God is all people's God. Is a religion where faith and works are hand in hand. Activism without love is not an effective activism in the long run. But love without activism must be questioned. Is it truly love? Remember that Bible full of holes? I don't want a religion full of holes, do you? Why? Because we are Christian. And faith without works is dead. Amen.